one of the, I would say, fundamental stories that if you're an entrepreneur and that you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I brand myself? How do I talk about what I do? I think there's the why story that's really key to that. So if you started a business, why? Because there's definitely a story there, whether it's an awakening that you experienced in your life or you coming more fully into your identity and enacting that out in the world through your business, or whether that's you recognizing a need that you were able to bring something to the table to help fill that need in people's lives.
Since the time of cavemen writing on walls and biblical figures reciting parables, people have been telling stories for literally thousands of years. And most of us, we learned our lessons on right and wrong from fairy tales, which are stories. And there's a good reason for that, because stories play a vital role in how we communicate and the actions we take. A Princeton researcher, Yuri Hassan, found that a story is the only way to activate the parts in the brain so that a listener turns the story into their own ideas and experience. And according to a Stanford marketing professor, Jennifer Aker, stories are remembered up to 22 times more than facts alone. So if you are a business owner, a leader, or just a regular person, you're trying to brand and market yourself or be more impactful in general, this episode is for you. Today's guest, Derrick Hatch, is going to help you understand why stories are so important, how to tell your story, and how you can create a narrative that helps you personally and professionally. But before I introduce him, today's episode is brought to you by Illuminating Wisdom, the premier coaching, consulting, and corporate wellness firm for high achievers in high stress roles. So whether you're seeking personal coaching, organizing a corporate retreat to address mental health and well-being issues, you want facilitation for a business strategy session, or you need engaging training for your team on legal and compliance matters, you can discover the solution that's right for you with Illuminating Wisdom. To sign up for our email list or learn more about how we can help you with your business, visit illuminatingwisdom.com or click the link in the show notes. So now on to the episode. Derrick, you and I are part of the same business mastermind, so I've seen some of your great work firsthand and personally. And in addition to your coaching and your workshops, you teach people how to tell their stories in 5 minutes and in 1 minute. So this is not be a challenge for you because it's what you do, but give us the 1 minute version of your story.
Sure. Well, Marcia, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. It is an honor to be here. And basically, in 1 minute, my story goes like this. Growing up, I loved all kinds of stories, but there was one story that I didn't really like, and that was my own. You see, I wanted my life to count for something, but when I found myself being bullied, depressed, and suicidal, I tried navigating it all alone. At 16, I miraculously survived a traumatic car accident, and with a second chance, I began sharing my story with people. Not only did this make me stronger, but it also inspired the people around me to share their stories. And so I was inspired to create a space where people could tell and learn how to navigate their stories more intentionally. And I've spent the last 14 years of my career doing this because I believe that no one should feel lost in their own story, which led me to creating All Things Narrative, a company that provides coaching and education that empowers people through storytelling. And so I believe you have a story worth telling and worth living. And so let All Things Narrative be your guide towards telling and living that story more meaningfully.
So this is so helpful, right? Because a lot of people who are listening, right, they're going to be entrepreneurs, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
they're pitching business. Maybe I have a lot of lawyers that listen. They've always got to go out and pitch to large corporations or other
Yeah.
business. And we're always telling stories, but we don't know how to do it. But before we get to the how,
Mm-hmm.
you've talked about your why, and the why is so important. You took being suicidal, being bullied, recovering from a tragic accident to change your life. At the time, you probably didn't think this is going to make my life so much better. How did you get to the point where you realized this is actually going to help you with your purpose? Because there's some people who don't recover from those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So how did you get there? And what would you say to somebody that says, "Well, I don't know, I'm still struggling to find my story"?
Yeah. No, those are all great questions, Marcia. So, first off, I would say that when I was going through those things, I was experiencing like a meaning crisis of sorts, a narrative void where I just kind of was hoping that my life was going to matter, that it was going to count
Mhm.
for something. and trying to find that in different places, trying to find it through being a musician, trying to find it through dating girls, trying to find it by being a good student in school or whatever it was. And when I got in that car accident, that began to shift the perspective for me. I experienced a narrative shift, if you will, where I started to recognize, okay, I'm here. Now what? And I think everybody has to answer that question at some point in their lives. Now what?
Right.
And I, as I shared in my intro, I've always loved stories. And so I started turning to stories to try to help make sense of my life and to try to first kind of put myself back together, right? And there were stories that I had to go back to that were, important to me and foundational as a child. There were new stories that I encountered because I wasn't raised religious, and so finding, like you mentioned, the biblical narratives in your intro. So those were life changing for me and giving me direction and guidance in terms of me thinking about the kind of stories that I wanted to live out. And so it starts with recognizing that you have a story that you are living out right now. And that comment that you made where, people might come and say, "Oh, I don't really have a story," or "I don't know my story." That is probably in all my years, probably the number one comment that I hear from people that really just breaks my heart, because I know what that feels like, to feel
Mhm.
like you don't really have a story. But the reality is that every single one of us does have a story. And what I believe that I had to do first for myself is I had to figure out, okay, well, what story am I living out and what story do I want to live out? And then
Right.
once I started to gain that clarity, I started surrounding myself with stories that could help me think through that help me reflect. Then I began sharing bits of my story more and more and more with other people, just little bits at a time, until I started to, it's honestly just a process, a continual ongoing process of kind of putting your narrative together. And it's a lot of trial and error, but I think that's the beauty of life, is that as we get better at telling our story, we start to look at the story we're telling and go, okay, well, what's the story that I'm living? And am I living out the kind of story that I want to?
Yeah. I love that. So when somebody comes to you and they say, "All right, now you've convinced me, I have a story.
Hmm.
What story do I tell and
Yeah.
when?" Right? I imagine people have lots of stories.
Hmm.
Oh,
Hmm.
they're full of stories, right? But there's a method to the madness. There's a method to how you tell the story, and we're going
Yeah.
to talk a little bit about that. But how does somebody figure out what story they have to tell? Because you can have some people who live just a ridiculous, extraordinary life,
Hmm.
and every day is to be a book. And
Yeah.
then some people might be like, I take the kids to school, I go to PTA, then I go to soccer practice. Who cares about my story?
Yeah. Yeah. When you get over that hump of realizing, okay, I do have a story, now what comes next? I think a lot of people that I find, including myself when I started this process many years ago, was like, if you take a box, like a box of puzzle pieces, and you dump the pieces on the table, and you just all of a sudden see all these pieces laying out, and it could be maybe a little overwhelming, right? If you've ever experienced that, of just, okay, I've got a 1,000 piece puzzle. Now what do I do? Okay, well, I start looking at, at least my strategies. I start looking at the edge pieces, right? Like what kind of forming the frame. And I think when you're learning to tell your story, it's very similar to that. You come out and you have all these different stories, because the truth is that there's hundreds and thousands of stories that we've lived out in our lives and that we will live out. And so how do we know which one of those to tell? And that's the beauty of the journey I go on with a lot of these clients, is figuring out, based on their situation, based on their needs, why they're telling these stories, who their audience is. All of those things are a factor in terms of pulling out what sort of stories you want to tell. But what I believe every single person needs to do when they want to become a better storyteller is kind of like with that puzzle, where you kind of start to look at the box and you start to go, okay, let me find all the edge pieces and form kind of like that frame. I think in the same way, you need to have some sort of overarching frame of what your story is. And when you alluded earlier to the 5 minute and the 1 minute versions, right? I think it just starts with getting your story out there, like just writing. or speaking. I have a lot of people, including myself, that love to, pull out the phone and you kind of talk to text. And it's a
Hmm.
great way to just start telling stories. And so that's always what I recommend with starting people is just start getting the stories out. And then over time, what we do is we kind of start to look at patterns and themes. And then we start to figure out, okay, let's get the frame first of the overarching story that you want to communicate with your life. And then from there, we have different sections and different pieces that we're going to go into more detail on, different corners, if you will. And being able to, through that, start to gain clarity about the story that we're telling and why we're telling it.
Fantastic. So let's go through some scenarios
Mm-hmm.
and think about, for the person listening, how might they use this and how
Yeah.
might they kind of get started? So let's say a person is an entrepreneur or a freelancer and they're trying to build their personal brand, or maybe anybody trying to
Mm-hmm.
build their personal brand. I think everybody thinks they want to be an influencer.
Yeah.
And by the way, everybody is an influencer in some
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
for good or for ill.
Yeah.
And even the concept of branding, right? We have a brand, whether or not we think we do. There's
Mm-hmm.
always a brand. So people are like, I'm not branding myself. Who do you think I am? You're always branding yourself,
Yeah.
right? So let's think about how can people be more intentional
Mm-hmm.
with building their personal brand through stories, whether they are, for example, a lawyer on LinkedIn that's trying to kind of do, just be more thought of as a thought leader,
Yeah.
or maybe they're a person who's starting their business, or they have a business and they want to be able to use storytelling that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question there. So I'm sure you've heard, and you kind of alluded to this in your intro, the statement that facts tell, but stories sell, right? And you
Absolutely.
mentioned that I think you said 22. That stories will
22
remember
times.
22
Yeah.
times more, right?
Yep.
And so one of the I would say fundamental stories that if you're an entrepreneur and that you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I brand myself? How do I talk about what I do? I think there's the why story that's really key to that. So if you started a business, why? Because there's definitely a story there, whether it's an awakening that you experienced in your life or you coming more fully into your identity and enacting that out in the world through your business, or whether that's you recognizing a need that you were able to bring something to the table to help fill that need in people's lives. I would say that getting that why story is so important because that really communicates your heartbeat. It communicates, okay, for the audience listener that's there, why am I going to do business with you? In other words, your why is going to be to answer the why, if you will, of why somebody would want to be your client or to take your business or try your product, whatever it is. And so being intentional about communicating that why, I mean, networking is a great avenue for that. If you're like in a networking setting and you only get 1 minute to get up and speak, one of those times that you're there in the first, at least, 3 times, your first 3 times there, one of those times I really think needs to be your why. So I would say your why story is one. And then another one that I think you really should have is a great how story. So it's not just about us. Donald Miller talks about this a lot. You are not the hero of the story. That is your
What?
customer. I know it can be hard sometimes to take that in, but um, so your why story is really what where you bring your personal touch of who you are and how you're connected to this. But we want to really present, as Donald Miller says, the customer as the hero as well. And so being able to have, I recommend having multiple ones of these, but you need at least one really powerful client testimonial that really speaks to how your business and what you do is impacting people. And being able to have that story that you can pull out to explain, you really want to, it's an art form to really keep the focus of the narrative on them, on the client, on that person who experienced the change. But as you're explaining it, you want to weave in as well, like how what you are offering, what you are doing, how it matters. So I think the way that we position that through that client testimonial house story, I think is also really key. So those are two that for sure you definitely got to have if you're an entrepreneur.
So let's use an example of that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a story of someone that that
Hmm.
transformed through working with you? And then the follow-up question is, how long should these stories be, right? So you're there to pitch the person or pitch the business, or you're trying to brand yourself as an entrepreneur, whether you're like a
Yeah.
lawyer pitching for clients or a
Yeah.
videographer, whatever it is. You
Hmm.
tell your why, this is my why. And let me tell you the story of Mary Jane who did X. Like, how
Hmm.
long is that client testimonial story? And maybe you could do it by telling us one so we can kind of see how it works in action.
Yeah. I think it all depends on your situation and your context, which is why I recommend having multiple versions of your story. If you get to speak on the stage and you get, 10 minutes, and you can spend 5 minutes talking about your why story, that's fantastic there. I do think a lot of situations that you're in, whether it's networking or elevator pitches or just being out in the community, you need to have shorter versions of that. So I'll give you an example of kind of a client testimonial one that I give there, and basically a technique of really how I frame this. This is approximately about 1 minute as well. It might be a few seconds over, but
Mm-hmm.
so do you know someone who struggles with memory challenges? You see, I lost two grandmas to Alzheimer's, and I wish I had more time to ask about their stories before they lost their memories. There's a great quote that says, all of us have a story to tell. How important it is to stop and reflect on our story, for we never quite know how or when it will end. And you see, that's why I created All Things Narrative, because I believe everyone has a story living inside of them. And I don't want anyone's story to get lost or anyone to feel lost in their own story. In one of my workshops, an attendee named Michael told me two things right off the bat. Number one, I don't have a story to tell. And number two, I struggle with a memory loss condition. But we began working together, uncovering his story, and through coaching and reflection, he gained a sense of narrative based on what he was able to recall. And now he no longer feels lost in the story. In fact, he loves telling his story through public speaking and writing, even penning his story in what has now become an Amazon best-selling book. When I think of Michael, I think of my two grandmas, and I'm grateful that his story is being told despite his memory challenges. And I believe that there's many people out there that likewise have a story waiting to be told. And if that's you, then let's connect.
Awesome. Right. And that's what people can do. So let's break that down and chunk it down in a few steps.
Yeah.
Of course, we clearly want people to go to your workshops and hire you, but so don't give us everything.
Sure.
But if somebody's sitting there saying, all right, I'm going to pull over right now because I'm going to do this. And
Hmm.
actually, I remember when you told this story on our mastermind, I
Hmm.
was driving. I was like, I need to pull over and write something down.
Oh,
So,
cool. Yeah.
so because I'm like, because this is like you get the light bulb moment. So for somebody who's thinking like, what are some of the steps that they can do to kind of put that together? So you talked earlier about figuring out, you've got a bunch of stories you have, figuring out that testimonial, but what's the structure there that you used? Because I think that's what will help people, kind of what kind of framework are you thinking of there?
Yeah. So there's actually different structures that I use, than that I teach clients as well.
Hmm.
And one of the first things that I always tell people when they start a workshop or working with me is I believe that every one of us has the capacity to be a storyteller, because we do it all the time. Somebody asks, "Oh, how was your weekend?" You could either sit there and say good, or you could say, "Oh, man, I did this and then I went here and we did that." So storytelling is such a fundamental part of our DNA as humans.
Hmm.
And so I believe that people have different styles and different structures that they naturally kind of gravitate towards, whether it's, the way they're influenced, because that's a whole other conversation, is that the stories you surround yourself with influence you. And so if love superhero stories, you're around what's called the hero's journey structure all the time. And so
Yes.
there's most likely that if you love superhero stories and you watch and read a lot of them, chances are if I asked you to tell me a story about you, you might tell it through that pattern, through that paradigm there of the hero's journey. And so there's structures that I think come naturally to us, and there's ones at the same time that we kind of have to learn and craft. So I, in that pattern that you just heard with the testimonial, I use a structure called a nested loop, and this is one that I teach as well. And a lot of people are really good at these, and a lot of people can be really good at them if they take the time to
Mhm.
craft it. So I don't recommend, I'll tell you what I don't recommend is trying to look up these structures and trying to fit your story to a structure.
Right.
Um, I've seen clients do that, and I kind of have to steer them away from that. What I always recommend is first get the raw form of the story out. Again, write it out, speak it out, however you want to get it out, but get it out in some way. And then once you have it on paper, then we could start to look at it and go, okay, what's here? What's missing? What does this kind of fall under? And then you just kind of play around with it. Like you take your you know, like if you're typing it, and let's say one of the things I recommend is like you highlight your theme statement. So every story should have some sort of clear theme to it. And a theme statement can really help make that clear to your audience,
Right.
especially when you're first starting out. So certain structures, you put the theme statement in the beginning, and that's how you start. And some of them you put in the middle, and some of them you have that be your finale, and that what you leave the right. So you just kind of play around depending on your audience, depending on your time, depending on which of these structures, because different structures have different purposes. So, like the hero's journey is excellent for trying to trying to explain your why story. A lot of people I recommend using that structure for that.
And give us a little bit of idea, because I think people have heard of the hero's journey, but
Yeah,
they may not know what it means. So again, without giving everything away for free, but giving some value during the
I'll
podcast.
give you everything you can look up on Google.
Okay. Excellent.
So the hero's journey was coined by Joseph Campbell. He wrote I'll back up actually. Joseph Campbell studied myths. He studied storytelling all throughout time and cultures, and he came to the conclusion that there were these different patterns of stories that we tell, and his work is building very much on Carl Jung, and that these patterns that we tell in stories are manifestations of our own psychology. And so our fictional stories are actually embedding within them parts of real life and our stories. And so the hero's journey is, or in that book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he outlines 17 of these patterns. And then as his career develops and others pick up on that, like a snowball, it develops into what we now know of as the hero's journey. And the funny thing is that we've been telling these kind of stories in Greek myths, in religious narratives and all these different places. But now in the 20th and 21st centuries, we're a lot more intentional about, oh, okay, I'm going to tell a hero's journey kind of story. And so that's the interesting thing about the time that we're in, is that we are a lot more conscientious and aware of the power of storytelling and how we are crafting stories. So it's a beautiful time with so many wonderful gifts out there in the world of how to tell your story. But yeah, the hero's journey is basically you start off in the known and the familiar, you take a journey into the unknown, the unfamiliar, you experience some sort of transformation while you're there, then you circle back to the known and the familiar, but you are a different person than when you started. And now, in light of what you learned, you now impart that to somebody, to the community, and your transformation leads to the transformation of others and sets them on their
Wonderful.
journey.
Awesome. You talked about your client who is out there being a public speaker and Amazon bestseller. As you know, a lot of people are like, all right, I've got a story to tell, but I'm really not trying to be out in public.
Sure.
Um, Even though that story could change a life for somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And you and I both know Wendy Bloom Weiss. We're both in the
Mm-hmm.
same mastermind with her. Her podcast will have aired before yours, and she talks about everybody's got a story. And
Mm-hmm.
if you've got a story, actually, you kind of have a duty to share that,
Yeah.
because your story can, like we said, save a life, change a life, get somebody in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
What do you say to the people that like, I'm really afraid to speak in public? What are some tips you have on that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'll kind of answer it two different ways. So,
Mhm.
first off, I think that finding like finding a safe space to really practice this, if you will. Um, so like if you're a part of like a small group or a community group or something like Toastmasters or something that's very tight knit and close, and you're fostering those relationships of trust over time, those are great avenues to begin to dip your toe in the water of public speaking, because it is daunting. There's a lot to it, and I really recommend, it could be even just the people in your own home. Maybe you sit down your spouse, and if maybe you have kids, and sit them down in the living room and you say, all right, I've been working on something. I want to just try to get up and share it. Find people that you trust, and, maybe invite someone out to Starbucks and just casually like begin to share things that you would talk about. Like, start in small steps. So one of the things I provide for those who are in South Florida is I provide an avenue for you when you're ready to take the next step. Like when you're ready to get onto a stage in front of people that some you might know, some you don't. That kind of next step avenue, because I provide an open mic for storytelling every quarter. So I've seen that be remarkable for people going from that intimate step to,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm getting better, but I'm not fully ready to go out there and conquer the world. So I need like that next step. So there's definitely things like that out there. Open mics, I think, are fantastic for that. Ones that are not competitive driven, that are ones that are just about honoring the space and honoring, each person up there. The other thing
Okay.
I'll mention with this as well, to kind of address the deeper issue at the heart of that, because Wendy's, absolutely right. If you have a story, you have an obligation to share that story, because you never know who is going to be impacted by it. And I'm going to speak out of my Christian background and tradition for a moment here.
Sure.
One of my favorite stories in the biblical narrative is of Jesus and his disciples. They go to the other side of the lake, and there's a man that comes rushing down the hill, and he's known, as the demoniac man, because he has some sort of demon. He's hurting himself. The village has cast him out. They have basically deemed his story worthless.
Mm.
And he comes to Jesus, and it's not even him speaking, it's that demon, it's the trauma that's speaking on his behalf. And Jesus is able to heal him of that. And it's a beautiful story. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but I think the most remarkable part of it at all is near the end, when Jesus and his disciples are getting ready to go back. They're getting to on the boat, and the man, who is now in his right mind, and he's so in his right mind that the people who cast him out, they're afraid, and they want to send Jesus away for that. And so the man kind of doesn't know what to do, doesn't know where to go. He's just had all this trauma and all this experience that he's had to deal with. And he goes up to Jesus and he asks to go with him. And you would think that,
Mhm.
kind Jesus would say, yeah, come on the boat, buddy. I got a place for you. But
Right.
he says, no. And he instead tells him, go back to your village and tell your story, and tell him of what the Lord has done for you. And so this man didn't need to go and get a degree. He didn't need to go like get an education. He
Right.
didn't need to it's weird, because he didn't even need to spend time, like he didn't need to go with them. Jesus is saying, you have what you need to go tell your story. You have the experience in you. And the cool thing that a lot of people don't mention with that story is there's actually a coda to it, where 2 chapters later in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus returns to that village, and instead of the people casting him away like they did before, they come to Jesus. They actually flock and they swarm him, and they bring another man who's in need of healing. So the implication is that the man went and told his story, and it actually transformed that village, and
Right.
now other lives are getting transformed there. So I love that story, just as a catalyst for thinking about, okay, I do have what I need. I do have this story. And if I can just get out there and start sharing it, even if it's raw, even if I don't completely have it all figured out, my story can be a catalyst for somebody else's story to change.
That's so compelling, and I hope that people, whether or not you're religious, whether or not you believe in what's in the Bible, it is itself a story about telling your story,
Mm-hmm.
and more importantly, people are going to remember that. I
Yeah.
guarantee you, somebody's going to be like, "Let me go back and look that up in the Bible. I don't remember that,"
Yeah.
but they'll remember it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be something that's, like you said, the catalyst. Now,
Right.
let's think about leaders, right? A lot of
Okay.
people that are listening to this podcast, it might be leaders, there might be bosses. And by the way, I think everybody can be a leader regardless of your title. But let's say
Mm-hmm.
you actually have a team of
Yeah.
people, and somebody might be saying, how can I use storytelling with my team?
Mm.
A few ways to think about it, right? Number one, it could be to help create a more inclusive and supportive culture at work.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a way. I'm actually flying to DC next week to do facilitate a retreat of a legal department. And one of the things I'm talking about is the importance of leadership
Mm.
and telling your story and being vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because if people see that the leader is vulnerable, they can themselves feel comfortable enough to share things, and it builds
Absolutely.
rapport. But you're going to have some people saying, I don't know if that's a good idea. That may be a little bit dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Do I really want to do that? So, how do you talk to leaders who might say, I think I might want to do this, but I'm a little worried. I might be getting too personal,
Yeah.
or I might make people feel uncomfortable. Is there something special that leaders of teams need to think about?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. The telling and receiving of stories, I believe, is a sacred act. So there is something about when you tell your story, you are bearing a part of yourself to those around you. And we have this narrative, so to speak, that in the workplace, in, corporate businesses or whatever the environment it is, we don't do that. We
Right.
don't we don't need to do that. We just need to buckle down and just get the work done, and we don't have time for all this. So one of the statistics that really has stuck with me over the years, I think this was the Harvard review that did this statistic here, that says that 71% of executives at businesses say that, and leaders, for this sake of this conversation, they say that employee engagement is critical to the success of their company. But according to a study that was done by Gallup, only 15% of people feel fully engaged and connected with their company. So 71% up here are saying that this is really, really important, and only 15% of people are actually feeling that. So how do we bridge that gap? So being able to foster a place within the workplace where people can use storytelling and use these different principles that we're talking about here in order to navigate the, and almost, like, if you will, like, provide language. So like a lot of organizations love like strengths finder
Yep.
and
That's
enneagram
interesting.
and disc
Right.
and all these different things, right? So I do something a little different with those I work with. I use what are called archetypes.
I wanted to ask you about that. Let's talk
Yeah.
about the archetypes.
Yeah, because I think the archetypes actually really help do this, but in a way that might not seem threatening, at least if it's done right. I definitely think, like anything, it can be butchered and not handled well. But archetypes are essentially, again, this comes from Jung as well, but archetypes are almost like character roles that you define yourself by, based on, okay, like, if this is my role in the organization, how do I do what I do meaningfully, if you will? What's the story that I'm telling myself that's keeping me going, doing this work, even when it's, tough, even when we're not meeting our goals? Like, what keeps me going here? So archetypes are really key to that. And so what I do when I work with organizations is I basically walk them through I mean, there's lots of theories about how many archetypes there are. I use 12. There tend to be 12 overarching ones.
Mhm.
So I walk them through the 12 archetypes. Whether it's like executive team, staff of, directors, leaders, and we're all in a room together and walking them through these archetypes and helping them, to see like, oh, yeah, that kind of sounds like me. And oh my gosh, that is not me up there. And some archetypes people get a little offended by, and some archetypes people feel really comfortable with. And we kind of
Yeah.
lean into that a little bit. Like, why is that? And so I have people kind of play musical chairs where they move around as I'm explaining the archetypes, and I have them out on each table. And I have them
Hmm.
kind of move around as they try to figure out, like, okay, in this organization, what's my archetypal role here? And then this is where I think it really gets good. It's not just them discovering their archetypes, but then it's how do we leverage them? How do we use them within the day to day of the organization here? And so there's a principle that we use in narrative practice called externalizing conversations, which is basically where we don't see people as the problems. We see problems situated in a context. And so when we're having a situation with somebody on our team, it could be very tempting to just go, oh man, Billy's the problem. We got to let Billy go, right? And we're not really pressing into what the problem is because we just need to get rid of Billy for whatever reason. And I'm not saying there's not times where you need to let people go, but let's look at the problem, because if we're not dealing with the problem, it's just going to repeat when, like George gets hired. So with combining archetypes and externalizing conversations, we can instead look at, okay, what archetype does Billy really operate out of? Like based on his role here. So let's say that Billy is an explorer. Let's say that he's a seeker archetype. And explorers and seekers, they kind of like to do their own thing. They kind of like to be left alone. It could be a little harder sometimes for them to be team players. And so, maybe we need to go, okay, so there's a healthy expression of that archetype where we're able to collaborate with the team as needed, but at the same time honor like how Billy does his work and how if he's giving us the results we want, right?
Right.
um so we can be able to use this language of archetypes to go, okay, like it's not that Billy is the problem, it's that Billy is operating out of, a certain set of identity.
Right.
And how does that rub against me? Because maybe I'm one of the archetypes that's more like of a like we're all a team, like why doesn't Billy like ever show up to like, like the team events and outings and stuff like
Right.
that? Like, does he really care about this place? Like all these kind of things I've heard in workplaces before, these conflicts here. And so being able to provide language with archetypes and being able to look at how do we are all on a journey towards better expressing the stories
Yes.
that we're telling. And archetypes provide a lot of great language in how we are navigating towards that and how we're moving together, because we can't do it alone. A healthy team and organization is recognizing the value of what each of these different archetypes, because on an organizational level, every archetype has a role in how they sustain the organization. And so being able to look at the problems that come up as like, okay, this is a problem that exists within this archetype or a clashing of these archetypes. So how do we navigate it? So it provides language that puts us all on the same playing
Right.
field, and it utilizes story and that world and that language in order to move forward to get our stories more aligned together.
Right. So, speaking of the workplace, one of the biggest problems people tend to have, well, at home as well, is that listening is a
Mm-hmm.
problem. So, we've
Yeah.
been talking about telling your story, but
Mm-hmm.
how do we train ourselves to become better listeners?
Yeah. So in narrative practice, we use something called witnessing. And I found this tool to be incredibly successful because when we listen, we tend to actually be thinking about what we're going to say next.
Hmm.
And I think we're all guilty of that. And so witnessing is a framework that kind of prevents you from doing that. It teaches you to slow down and to be active in what you are listening for when we want to connect with someone, because it's a powerful, powerful way to connect with someone. And so, do you want me to like kind of give an example of the
I would love
like
that.
of it?
Thank you.
Okay. So there's four steps in this framework of witnessing. So the first one is what's called the expression. And so the expression is basically what stood out to you about what the person shared. So you're not reinterpreting it. You're not giving your own spin to it. You're not putting it in your own language. You are trying to capture the words and language of the person that you're listening to. And that can actually be quite more difficult than you think it is, to not think in your terms, but to put yourself in their shoes and utilize and adopt their language. So can you, that's the first step of witnessing, is can you repeat back what somebody shared in their language, not in your analysis or interpretation or your own words. So that's like the first piece of it there, right?
I think that sounds like marriage counseling, right? But that's
Yeah,
good,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Oh,
Because
well, so fun fact. So what I'm describing here, a lot of things I'm describing, they all originate in therapy. So
yeah,
archetypes
absolutely.
originated in therapy, witnessing originated in therapy. A lot of the stuff that we have, because we've learned over the years that in therapeutic contexts, we've learned how important it is for people to tell and listen to the stories of, us and one another. And so a lot of things that we know about narrative today, they really are situated in a therapeutic context. So I've definitely had that where I've
Mhm.
actually done this framework with
Right,
organizations, and they go like, this kind of feels a little bit like therapy.
right.
And I did it with a room full of therapists one time, and they were just like, oh yeah, this feels familiar. So that was funny. But anyways,
So we got step one.
yeah. So the second step is what image comes to mind about the person. So, in other words, as you heard them sharing, what what do you see about that person that maybe you didn't before, or maybe did you gain a sense of clarity about them? So, I might be listening to you telling a part of your story, and you might be telling me about a really life changing experience where you really had to go through a lot.
Mhm.
And I might sit there and go, wow, I've worked alongside Marcia for quite a while. And, I knew that she was diligent, but I have such a greater sense of just her resilience for everything that she's been through. And it really makes sense how she can handle these challenges so well. So that's the second step there, is recognizing, okay, like, how am I better understanding the person through what they're listening? And again, notice how we're 2 stages in and we haven't even gotten to me yet. We're completely on the person and honoring them. Now, the third one is when we start to build a little bit more of a bridge, and that's sharing resonance. What personally resonates with you? And so I might go, wow, when Marcia shared that story about how she experienced all this financial loss and how she slowly was building it back bit by bit. Wow, like that, I relate to that so much. And now there's a bridge that's being formed between us, because now I'm opening up and sharing a piece of my story and how it connects with you. And then the last step of that is the transport, which is, what am I going to take with me in light of this conversation? So it could be, okay, I need to implement this step, or I need to go reconnect with this kind of person, or whatever it is. Being able to have an intentional action step, a wisdom piece, something that you're taking away from the conversation, so that it just doesn't kind of go like that. Because I think that can happen a lot, unfortunately. But really being intentional about, okay, I've listened to you, and now what am I going to do with that?
Got it. So we've got the four different steps. Um, so I want to turn now to, you have your own podcast called
Mm-hmm.
Live a Meaningful Story.
Yeah.
And you dive into how stories and films help make sense of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So is there, and I've listened to a few episodes as well. I was like, wow, I
Oh,
need to go back
cool.
and watch the trailer. So, and I was listening to, when you're talking about different movies and such, I'm like, do I need to go back and watch the Transformers? I didn't think it was that deep, but, but apparently it is, right?
Well, it
So,
is. Well, it is for that person. There's four of us that do the show,
right,
and we take turns choosing all those films.
right,
And film is the most what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a macro language of storytelling that we have, because all of us, we can go into a place, we could sit down in our living room and go to a movie theater, and we can all experience a story together in just a couple hours.
yeah.
And that's incredible there. Like being able to have that ability to do that. Plays like going to the theater, that's another example of that. So yeah, anyways.
So what's yours, the film? If you, I mean, I'm sure there's a million.
Yeah.
And I always ask people, so this shouldn't be as hard for you, because I often ask people, what's a film, a story, a song, a poem that changed
Yeah.
your life? So what is that film or that story that really changed your perspective?
There's so many, as you shared, but I'll share actually a recent one that's been really doing a lot in me. So when you were listening to the podcast, did you listen to the episode we did on Pinocchio?
I did not that
Okay.
one.
So that one just came out about a month ago from the time that we recorded this. And so that's a story that I grew up with. And it's a story that, like the Disney version,
Hmm.
that was really important to my childhood, because Pinocchio is this very archetypal story about growing up, coming of age, finding your place in the world. And so you have the different temptations and trials that Pinocchio undergoes, and they all represent different aspects of growing up. So it's beautiful that I had that, at that age. Now in 2024, I've been a father for the last 7 years. And so when I watch a story like Pinocchio, I'm actually putting myself in Geppetto's place a lot and trying to
Mm.
imagine that. And a couple years ago, Guillermo del Toro came out with his version of Pinocchio, which is on Netflix. And his version of it is more from the perspective of Geppetto, and as he says in his words, hit the journey of becoming a father, and an imperfect father learning to embrace their imperfect child. And so when I watched that film a couple years ago, it for the first time, it absolutely wrecked me. And it wrecks me every time I see it, because um, I'm just going to lightly spoil it here, just a little bit of it. But there's a moment early on where Geppetto has a son and he loses that son. And so Pinocchio is born out of this grief of losing a son, and the son represents like the idealized child, like all of
Yeah.
your hopes and ambitions and dreams for your child. And Pinocchio obviously is imperfect, especially if you read the actual book. He's not
Right.
like the Disney version. He's kind of a
Exactly.
hot mess. So in that film, Geppetto has to learn to let go of some of those expectations that he's holding his son to. And at the same time, Pinocchio has to take a healthy dose of what Geppetto's instilling and what he's learning from others. And basically, he has to find his way in the world through a very wayward path. And I think sometimes as parents, we want to try to protect our kids from all these things and all these different experiences. And you hope that everything you say is just going to go, they're going to take it and they're going to go out in the world and thrive. But the reality is that life is a lot messier. And I think this film is really helping me as a father kind of navigate the story that I'm living out with my three children. And especially as my oldest one, is well into school age now, and she's dealing with different things that come
Mhm.
out, and me recognizing what my role is as her father. And so the story, that film really provides a lot of language, a lot of powerful images, a lot of, very symbolic, archetypal storytelling that's helping me to really just think through, like, okay, what am I holding my child to a standard that's unattainable for them? Am I playing the comparison trap? And all these different things that we experience. So that's a film, that's a story, that's an example of a story that's been very important to me all throughout my life, and how different versions of the same story are speak to me at different times in my life.
I love that. And people should go back and watch. And also you said something important, right? A lot of the fairy tales that I talked about in the top of the hour, right? They're the ones we see on the Disney versions are a lot grimmer than some of the actual, I mean, a lot less grim, a lot
Yeah,
more
they're a lot tamer.
child friendly than some of the original fairy tales that they're taken from. So
Yeah,
it's all,
100%. I
you know, Hans Christian Andersen, Grimm's fairy tale. A lot of these are pretty dark.
I read my kids when we do fairy tales. I read them the actual ones from
Really?
Grimm, and I've had a couple people be like, "Why are you doing that?" And I mean, I truly believe that we have to ease our children into the harshness of life, and those fairy tales are, they're great gateways to having those conversations and being proactive as a parent rather than reactive. When your child comes home and says, "Oh my gosh, like Billy said this at school, dad," like,
Yes.
and you're like, "Oh great, now I got to talk to them about drugs now, or I got to talk to
Right.
them
Right.
about this, that," right? Fairy tales are an excellent, like, the Grimms and those non-watered down ones. I mean, obviously use with discretion with your kid, but my kids, I think they handle it pretty well, and they provide great conversations. So,
I love that. And what's the biggest mistake that people make when trying to tell their story?
mm, the biggest mistake. There's a lot I can think of, but I think one that I'll
Or
give.
maybe you can give three if you want to, if you don't want to narrow it down to one.
Yeah, I would say the first one that comes to mind is that a lot of people are afraid to let the story and the power of the story speak for itself. And what I mean by that is they'll tell the story, but they won't really think that's enough. And so they'll feel like they have to add a lot of things to it. They'll feel like they need to almost lecture or sermonize, if you will, like different things about the story to the audience. And there's a very careful balance, because we know when we're listening to a story, you especially will notice this when you're watching a movie and we're losing the plot and we're now just kind of lecturing the audience and sermonizing the audience. And I mean, there's a place for that, there's context for that, but in terms of telling your story, um, that that's definitely one that I see a lot, is trying not to fall into that trap, letting the story and the power of the story speak for itself, and not feeling like you have to fill in all the gaps. And I'll do one more as well that kind of goes off that, is a lot of times, especially, like, I love when people speak from the heart, but I think there's a lot of people that they get up there and they try to wing it, and there's a lot of unnecessary pieces that they just feel like just have to be there. And I'm guilty of this too. Like,
Right.
I'll be like, "Oh my gosh, this part of the story is so funny, we have to keep it." But in reality, it has nothing to do with everything else you just said. And it actually, what it does is it pulls the audience away from the central narrative, and it gets them thinking about something else. It takes them down a trail. And sometimes it can be hard to bring them back, because they might be so stuck on that one joke that you shared that was so dang funny.
Right.
And now they're thinking about it. Or another example of that is when people will, like, give their kind of opinion on something that doesn't really have to do with the story, but it might come out of like one little point. And they say, like, I've had people say things like this before, where they might say something like, "Well, and that's why we need to, get out there and vote for such and such." And I'm just like, that completely deters away from
Yeah.
the story. When you try to drop those things, or you try to add these little things, they take away. So you have to, there is an art and a finesse to being able to purge your story of things that might not need to be there, even though you think they need to be there. We all think that everything that we are going to put is awesome and good, but put yourself in the shoes of your audience and think, is this bringing them closer? Like Robert McKee talks about this, and this is like part of my coaching as well, is that every single thing that you share in your story needs to turn the story towards the next thing you're about to say. And if there's ever anything at all that isn't that bridge between what you just said and what you're about to say, it needs to go. You need to cut it. You can always put it somewhere else. You could save it for a lecture or a sermon, but it doesn't have to be here for this story.
I love it. So, speaking of your coaching, you, number one, have a special offer for our listeners. And number
Mm-hmm.
two, I really want as many people as possible to kind of reach out to you, whether they are individuals who want to learn how to tell their story, or I can see so many, businesses where learning about this is going to be really, really important.
Yeah.
So, what is your special offer and how can people work with you?
Yeah. So at allthingsnarrative.com, we are going to offer those listening to this podcast, we're going to offer you a free consultation or a discovery call, if you will, where we're going to spend, 30 minutes talking through where you're at as a storyteller. Talking about maybe what your goals are. Do you want to speak? Do you want to write? Is this something you want to do for your team, for an organization? And trying to really come up with a game plan of what the next step is in terms of developing your story. Some people might be listening to this and you might be at the very beginning of this journey. And I have coaching and different things for people who are at the beginning of this journey and they're like, I just need to figure out the story.
Right.
Can we just start there? Yes. I am so passionate about this stage of just getting people. I take them on a journey through different creative exercises, through different narrative practices, and you will get experience coming up with your stories. But you're also going to have a guide here who's going to come alongside and listen to you as we work it out. I kind of like act as like a counselor, an investigative reporter, where I just ask a lot of questions and we really try to get the story out there. So that might be some of you listening, and others of you are like, okay, I've got the story, but I need to get those 5-minute versions. I need to get those 1-minute versions. I need to figure out what specific stories I want to tell for this project or that speaking engagement. So storytelling for speakers, that's a coaching and workshop that I do as well. Being able to sit down with you and now go, okay, well, what if we tried this story as a hero's journey? Let's practice it. And being able to have somebody there that can, like if you have a story typed out and I give homework assignments and different things, and then I go into the Google Doc and I say, okay, let's try this and implement that. And it's a really collaborative process. But at the end of the day, whichever route you want to go with coaching and education and whatnot, is at All Things Narrative, I am just passionate about empowering you to grow your to develop your voice as a storyteller. And I believe that through what we offer, we will help get you to where you want to go, so that your story can be out there, and that it can not only can you thrive, but your story can touch lives and inspire the stories of others to thrive as well.
Well, that is the perfect note to end on. Thank you to Derrick Hatch. We'll have all of his information in the show notes. I know you guys will find this useful because I found it incredibly useful. Make sure you listen to it again, forward it to your friends, subscribe to the Illuminating Wisdom podcast, YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple, whatever your streaming area of choice. And also, please make sure to check out Derrick's website and also his podcast. So thanks so much, Derrick, for being with us. And everybody else, take care. Have a stellar day.
Thank you.